Peter Sankey is an author that the council has grown very familiar with. We have worked through one of his books, and he presents much the same thing as we are dealing with and struggling with here this morning in his book entitled Healthy Congregations. He writes, "I'm sure that there are many of the people in the pew who hear these words about being a servant of all, but they wouldn't consider themselves to be ministers, because that's what the pastor and his job is all about. I've seen some congregational bulletins and newsletters," he says, "that list pastor and his or her name, and then minister, and say all of the members of the congregation." He goes on to say that's appropriate because there are just too many little children, too many unimportant people in the world to welcome for us pastors to do it all ourselves. And that is the challenge for us here today as well. Do we take time to struggle with and put ourselves in that space between, so that we can ask the right questions of what it means to be a disciple of Christ, and so that we can learn to live into the right responses? I remember 12 or so years ago going on a mission trip to an orphanage in Sonora, Mexico, with the youth from Gloria Lutheran Church. Lauren Rue, Katie Magnuson, Eric Hambrick, and Kim Severud were part of the crew that went down with me. But I remember it was my wife, Kristen, who was the most concerned with how we would connect with the children who were down there, especially since most of us didn't speak a word of Spanish. But I will never forget the look on my wife's face once we got there, as she sat on the edge of a cement slab basketball court and allowed one of the little girls from the orphanage to play with her light brown, sandy brown hair and to begin braiding it. The smile on both of their faces was enough to recognize that they had indeed made a connection. In her willingness to come on the trip in the first place, to set aside her fears and her worry, and to spend time with children from a different culture, children who spoke a different language, my wife helped one little girl feel loved. And in so doing, she experienced that same love in return. This is the kind of agape love that Jesus invites the disciple and us too today to be a part of. This is the kind of unconditional, sacrificial love that Jesus models for us. When we read in our gospel that he reaches down and takes a small child and places it among the disciples. A child, referred to as an it. Did you catch that? An it. Because it didn't matter whether it was a boy or a girl. Jesus takes a child who would have no value whatsoever in his day. A child who represents the least, the last, the lost, the little. A child who would have nothing to offer, nothing for us to gain from. But that is who we are to welcome. So may we open ourselves to the challenge. May we set aside our fears and our worries. May we be intentional in finding the space between. The space between social issues and belief systems. The space between personality traits and working relationships. The space between questions that we are afraid to ask and answers that we are afraid to hear. For it is there, in that space, that we find the growing space of God's grace. find ourselves there, then, like my wife, we might just find ourselves as we are lost in the warmth of a child's laughter. That is the joy of finding the face of Jesus in the least, the lost, the last, and the little. My friends, that is the path of discipleship worth following.